This episode of Metatrex is brought to you by Enterprise in Space. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter. Visit enterpriseinspace.org for more information. And if you'd like to help us keep Star Trek discussion coming to you each day, consider becoming a patron of the network through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/trekfm and find out how you can become part of the team. That's patreon.com/trekfm.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
There's no greater challenge than the study of philosophy.
My philosophy is that there is room for all philosophies on this station.
Hi everybody, and welcome to episode 65 of Metatrex, Trek FM show on Star Trek and philosophy. My name is Zachary Fruhling, and with me as he always is Mike Morrison. Today we'll be discussing the philosophical themes and issues in the two-part Star Trek The Next Generation episode, Birthright Parts 1 and 2. Mike, you and I touched on Birthright Parts 1 and 2 in our last episode of Metatrex when we talked about essential Trek philosophy from Star Trek The Next Generation Season 6. In that episode, we made the connection between Worf and Socrates in the history of philosophy, and we thought that was such an interesting connection that we would pick that thread up and spend a little more time talking about these episodes, Birthright Parts 1 and 2.
This is not one of the most popular episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation. It's kind of fascinating to me because the sixth season actually had 4 two-part episodes that are associated with the season. 2 of those episodes were two-parters at the beginning of the season, at the end of the season. So, you know, we have some trickle into previous seasons and seasons yet to come. The 2 that are kind of sandwiched in between, Chain of Command and Birthright being the latter of the 2, this really didn't connect well, I think, with a lot of people. I don't hear a lot of chit-chat about it on the boards out there. And when we were talking Essential Trek philosophy, I made the connection with Worf being a type of Socrates inside this episode, because much like Socrates, Worf is accused of poisoning the minds of the youth. And I thought that was pretty fascinating. But there's some other things in this episode as well that I think we're going to touch on in today's episode of Metatrex that I think our listeners will find interesting. There's really a lot of philosophical content within these 2 episodes, Birthright Part 1 and Birthright Part 2, that I think a lot of people can look over if they're not looking for it.
I know for a fact that you and I both enjoy talking about underappreciated episodes of Star Trek and their connections to philosophy, and I think this episode falls into that category. I mean, the parallel with Socrates is pretty good. Worf is basically accused of corrupting the minds of the youth, and the parallel with Socrates is so strong that Worf in this episode very nearly has to end his life, not quite by drinking the hemlock, or in this case, the Romulan hemlock, but it's pretty close.
It's pretty close. There are a lot of similarities between Worf in Birthright, especially Part 2. That's where we get the most storyline that involves Worf and his involvement with this Romulan/Klingon colony that he's happened about. But the similarities between Worf and Socrates are actually many, much the same way that Socrates, who in a lot of ways was opposed to the political system of his time, and he would use his influence to really direct what he was saying to young people, and young people were really kind of flocking, and he got this kind of reputation, Socrates did, as a gadfly, and we kind of get to see, Worf being that kind of gadfly in this episode, where he is just a pain in the neck to that poor Romulan who's overseeing this camp, and to the point that he threatens him, and we get to see this kind of smug Worf when he realizes that he's starting to have an impact on these young people, and he's really starting to cause them to look inside themselves to find what it is that is in them that is really Klingon, and to more importantly question the authority of the elder Klingons and the Romulans who are in this camp. And when he does, there's a scene, Zachary, where this young Klingon brings this fresh kill in, and he slams it down on the table, and he's got these Klingons singing and rejoicing over this kill, and the Romulan, he's just appalled at it, and Worf is just standing over in the corner with this smug look on his face, smiling at the influence that he's had. And it's very, very much, I think, a picture of Socrates in his time.
I'm glad you thought to mention the fact that Socrates called himself a gadfly, kind of meandering around Athens, being an irritating factor, poking people into realizing they don't know as much as they think they do. And that's essentially what Socrates did. I mean, Socrates didn't have his own, well worked out political system or philosophical system, really. He, through Socratic, what came to be known as Socratic questioning, would kind of, he'd run into a statesman and say something like, "Oh, you must know a lot about justice since you're a statesman, right?" And in the course of asking them a bunch of questions, he would get them to realize they don't know the first thing about the things they're supposed to be experts in. So he would really be an irritant and would ruffle a lot of political feathers, of course, eventually leading to his own death. And that's essentially what Worf is doing in this episode. Worf is being as disruptive as he can possibly be to this colony.
Yeah, he finds lots of ways to disrupt it, and some more subtle than others. Now, I don't recall ever studying and learning about Socrates, detonating a small explosive device in order to try to escape.
Yeah, but, that's one of the lost Plato dialogues. That one was lost in the burning of the Library of Alexandria.
Yeah. Worf finds lots of ways to disrupt things in this colony. It's detonating a small explosive, and all the way to just doing some Klingon Tai Chi out in the courtyard to just generate questions. Some kids are playing with seemingly toys, and he shows them how these are tools to sharpen the skill of a warrior and a hunter. And so he finds all kinds of ways to disrupt things that are going on in this colony, much the same way that Socrates, in sometimes very subtle ways, would disrupt things in his own in his own world.
Well, let's spend a minute thinking about the parallel or the disparallel between Worf and Socrates. So they're both basically in the eyes of the colony, corrupting the minds of the youth, right? Certainly there's the potential execution that Worf has to face in the episode. Worf is being disruptive, more literally, of course, than Socrates being disruptive through dialogue and through Socratic discussion. But are there any other parallels, and what are the dissimilarities? I mean, Socrates was accused of corrupting the minds of the youth, but also not believing in the gods of the state. And this is interesting because Worf is kind of taking the opposite approach here. I mean, Worf is trying to get these young Klingons to embrace their Klingon heritage, more like believing in the gods of the state than not believing in the gods of the state. Embracing their stories, embracing their heritage, embracing their cultural specificity.
Sure, but in this colony, Zachary, the Romulans really, to some degree, by and large, are in charge. I mean, there's a Klingon elder who has some authority. In fact, one of the things that Tokath does to try to deal with Worf is he refers him to Lakor to deal with, the Klingon elder. He basically says to him, he's your problem. You deal with him the way you want to deal with him. But if he continues to disrupt things here, I'm going to handle it. And, it's implied at that point that, Worf's life is really in Lakor's hands. And so I think to a great degree, Tokath is in charge of this colony. So I think it can be argued that Worf, to some degree, it's not necessarily the gods, but let's just say the system that's in place here. Yeah. Metaphorically speaking, he's opposed to the system that's in place here. And as you and I talked about in our last episode of Metatrek 64, where we were talking about season 6 of Star Trek: The Next Generation, you and I both came to the conclusion that it wasn't necessarily that Worf was opposed to the peace that existed between the Romulans and the Klingons. It was the fact that the Klingons were not acting like Klingons any longer. They had forgotten who they were and where they came from, and that was translated in the fact that they didn't share their stories. They didn't understand the meaning of their songs. They still knew the songs, but they didn't know what they meant. And as we talked about, their batliths had been allowed to rust. In fact, Worf, pulls out a Klingon blade, and he says it shouldn't be allowed to rust as it has. And so, he's disappointed in the fact that these Klingons have their heritage tucked inside little boxes, and they're answering to the authority of these Romulans, Tokath and the Romulans, who are subverting everything that makes them Klingon.
It's interesting to think what would have happened had Worf actually become a martyr if he had been executed. Would he have become as well known as Socrates is several thousand years after the fact, in future Star Trek history? Would he have been the founder of like a Klingon origin movement, with this small band of Klingons remembered Worf as the founder of their neo-Klingon movement?
I think there's another episode of Deep Space Nine that kind of follows that storyline, as memory serves. Of course, Zachary, I'm talking about Children of Time. Worf was their patriarch of old.
Half jokingly, do you think they'll tell stories of Worf and his disciples, every Sunday or every Sunday? Every Sunday, will they take communion with a glass of blood wine and some targ meat?
Prune juice
And targ meat.
Raise that warrior's glass. Prune juice extra large for everybody. Yes, songs will be sung and prune juice will be drank in remembrance of Worf. Zachary, you referred a moment ago to Worf being sentenced to death, and I think there are some similarities there that we didn't really talk about in depth. Biel comes to him at one point after he's been sentenced to die the next day, and she is going to help him escape, and he tells her, "I'm not running. I'm not going to escape." Now, earlier in this two-parter, he does attempt an escape, but he's...
How un-Socrates-like.
How un-Socrates-like. But when he sees that he's having an impact, that he's influencing these young Klingons, he basically tells her that for him to run would be to undermine everything that is Klingon. And he knows that he wouldn't be offering a very good example if he ran like a coward. And I think I think there's something very Socratic about that. Although we don't know why Socrates refused to run or escape, he basically he was given an opportunity to get out of his execution, and he chose not to. We really don't know for sure why, but at least with Worf, we know that it was about giving an example, a full example of what it is to be Klingon.
Well, while there is a parallel between Socrates not being willing to sort of flee and avoid execution and Worf not being willing to avoid execution, I think there's a structural difference. We do actually have a little bit of evidence about why Socrates wouldn't try to escape or try to flee from his own execution. In the Socratic dialogue, the Crito, Socrates basically says that, look, he's lived his entire life as a citizen of Athens, tacitly accepted its laws, and now when the laws turn against him, to sort of turn his back on the laws that he's accepted and lived by his entire life would be kind of a contradiction, wouldn't be in good faith. So he does give his justification. He says, I've accepted these laws my entire life, and to turn my back on the laws now, it would not be just.
Right. And I think that's one of the problems that we have with Socrates, because what we know really about his life is really a secondhand telling, mostly by Plato. But even that to some degree is ambiguous. There are lots of, several proposed ideas for why perhaps he chose to stay, and that being probably the strongest argument of them. There are suggestions that to flee would indicate that he was afraid to die, and that wasn't the case at all.
Well, and that's specifically addressed in the Platonic dialogue, the Phaedo, where he gives several arguments for the immortality of the soul, reasons not to be afraid of death.
Then there's the idea that if he were to flee and go someplace else, that he would have as difficult a time with his teaching, with his ideas someplace else as he was having there.
Yeah, it wouldn't be accepted any better anywhere else. It's not like the neighboring city-state is any more just than Athens.
Yes.
It'd be like an American saying, "Let me go over to Russia. They're so much more just over there."
And then there was the idea that, his friends that were telling him, to get out of Dodge, there was, a suggestion that that he would be putting them in danger, and he didn't want to endanger, his friends. And I think that Worf certainly felt that for Biel. He didn't want to create any kind of difficulties for her, because after all, her father was Tokath, the very man who was wanting to execute Worf.
I think, of course, it's hard to know how strong the parallel really is. Like you said, what we know about Socrates comes largely secondhand, mostly through Plato, through a couple of other sources. Plato scholars generally agree that the early Platonic dialogues, like the Phaedo and the Crito and so on, are more historically accurate than the later Platonic dialogues, in which Plato is basically using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own well-developed philosophy at that point. But the early Platonic dialogues, like the ones recounting the discussions that Socrates was having, close to the time he was executed, and the ones that really show Socrates as a gadfly, meandering around Athens, bumping into someone who claims to know what they're doing in their field, whether they're a politician or a statesman or a doctor or whatever, and just asking questions, getting that person to realize they don't really know what they're talking about. And it's not like they come to any real resolution. No well-developed philosophy ensues. The person goes, "Oh, maybe I don't really know what I'm talking about after all," after Socrates asks them all these probing questions, and then Socrates wanders off. That's kind of the structure of those older, more historically accurate Platonic dialogues. So, of course, we don't really know, so we can't settle the question, how strong of a parallel is this really? There are some structural parallels. Like we said, Worf is accused of corrupting the minds of the youth. He's being something like a gadfly, maybe a little more strong, a little stronger than Socrates. Worf is actually, setting off, pipe bombs. Socrates didn't set off a lot of pipe bombs in that, although he was in the Athenian army at one point, and people forget that.
He did serve in the military, and I think that could be a fair connection to our friend Worf as well.
But we don't really know for sure what Socrates' motivations were, other than what Plato has to say in the dialogues. And, all we have to... And, of course, Worf is fictional, so...
Yes. Let us not forget that Worf is fictional.
I mean, I know we're supposed to be serious here on Metatrex, but while we're thinking about it, I love this idea that Worf in this little compound had a student, like the guy, like the Klingon kid that he teaches to go hunting.
Talk.
Talk.
Like
what if that became his pupil, and he ends up becoming the Plato of this Neo-Klingon empire, and he writes all of the dialogues about what Worf did and said during this episode. So there are the early talk dialogues and the late talk dialogues, but the early talk dialogues are generally accepted to be a more accurate reflection of what Worf actually did and said.
It's funny you should say that, because that really becomes sort of the turning point, if you will. That was the straw that broke the camel's back when Tokath sees the influence that Worf has on talk. I mean, he comes in and he's telling the stories of Kalis, and he's talking about the hunt, and he starts, singing this Klingon victory song, and all of a sudden that's the turning point. So yes, talk does become, at first he's a critic of Worf, but suddenly he realizes that what Worf has to say resonates with who he is. And I can totally see it, because it's talk in that banquet hall going, I was out there on the hunt and I felt the thrill of the chase. And then he breaks out into this song, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, this kid, he's infected. And I think that Tokath's response to that was, I better kill him now before this is what happens after a few days. I better kill him now.
Yeah, I got to squash this new movement, Worfism. Yeah, a little known, seldom discussed historical fact is that Socrates also liked prune juice.
It is a warrior's drink.
You don't hear about that in intro to philosophy classes. You only hear about that here on Metatrex.
And really, that's why Worf was willing to die. He couldn't get any decent prune juice in that compound.
So Worf is the founder, just to make sure I have this right. Worf is the founder of this new movement. Talk becomes the record keeper that takes Worf and gives him a voice and creates these epic Klingon dialogues with Worf as the main character, being a gadfly, stinging and poking and prodding and blowing up pipe bombs in this compound. And of course, in later Klingon history, there are resurgent movements. You get neo-talkism, like there's Neoplatonism, here in the real world. So is this plausible?
I think you're onto something.
I would like to have seen that sequel to this episode, but
an alternate universe sequel.
Yeah, just set in the future at some point.
Yeah, where Worf doesn't actually leave the settlement.
That would be really interesting.
He dies. Of course, the final scene that we see in Birthright is Worf coming back aboard the Enterprise, and he has Talk in tow, and so, Talk and obviously some of the other young people were allowed to leave, and Worf bends the truth a little bit with Captain Picard, although I suspect that Captain Picard knows that he's not being completely forthright. But, the assumption here is that Talk and many of the young people actually end up leaving the colony, and that would have been pretty interesting if Worf would have died. Of course, that's another one of the differences between Worf and Socrates is that Socrates actually drank the hemlock and died. Worf doesn't die. In fact, all of the young people, I say everyone, but all of the young people ultimately come around him and basically offer their lives. If you're going to kill him, you have to kill me. Talk being one of them, and then ultimately Baal being one of them as well. And Tokath, seeing his own daughter there, and then his wife steps in and has him drop the disruptor, and all as well. And that's how the episode ends. But I think it would have been interesting if he would have just gone ahead and killed Worf, and we would have had this, this divided society and this movement and neo movements and.
Well, to beat this dead targ of an analogy even further, just like for Plato, his greatest work was the Republic, the political treatise in which he discusses the ideal form of the state and the ideal form of knowledge. Do you think that Talk's greatest work was called The Empire? And in that great political work, he discusses the ideal form of the Klingon Empire and the abstract ideal form of the Batleth?
Well, you actually make an interesting point here, Zachary. In the midst of your tomfoolery, you make actually a really good point. And I want to pause there for just a second.
Tomfoolery.
Something that you and I have mentioned about Worf more than a couple of times is the fact that Worf has this idealized Klingon heritage. He sets standards that he can't even live up to. It's questionable, how much, to what degree he really understands what it is to be Klingon. As we've talked about before, even Guinan calls him on it and says, you're not like a lot of Klingons I know. And every real Klingon that he comes in contact with basically tells him that he's not a very good Klingon. So, but here Worf again is preaching this gospel of this idealized Klingon, and it's resonating with Klingons who don't really know what it is to be Klingon. And I think that's really interesting, and I think there's a nuance there that I think's worth talking about, because here we see a real example, just like we do with Children of Time. We get to see this kind of idealized canon of Worf's imaginations of what it would be to be Klingon, and how he presents that and the impact that it has on the people that he shares that with.
I'm glad my tomfoolery led to something productive in our discussion, but this is a really interesting connection, actually, now that I think about it, because in Plato's Republic, one of the objections that's given to Socrates in the dialogue is that this idealized society that they've been discussing is not practical, that's not realistic. It's too utopian, too abstract. Mm-hmm. And Socrates basically replies by saying, yeah, that's not practical, maybe here in the real world, but it sets our ideals. It sets the goal, what we're striving for in a society. And I think the same is true of Worf. You might say to Worf, your view of what the Klingon Empire could be is not practical. It's not realistic. It's false. It's a fiction. And he would say, yes, but our Klingon ideals define who we are, whether or not we can live up to them.
And isn't that the spirit of Star Trek as a whole? I mean, it sets an ideal that can be argued that it's just impossible. It's an impossible ideal. We've talked about many of these threads before. The idea that economics in the 24th century is entirely different than the economics of today, and the idea of man just simply working to better himself and others. Is that an idealized utopia? This idea that Earth being paradise. I just finished watching, some episodes of Deep Space Nine where they're talking very heavily about Earth being, a paradise. And is this an unattainable goal? Well, it is what it is. It's set out there as something to work towards, to strive towards. And if we can move even a step or two steps towards that, we're better off than where we're at now. And I think that's Birthright, I think, really presents that kind of in a capsule all by itself. It really is the spirit of Star Trek. It really is the philosophy of Star Trek to some degree, encapsulated inside really part 2 of Birthright more than it is in part 1.
Well, I'm not sure I have too much more to add on the Socrates connection, except that the Klingon pronunciation of Socrates is epic. Socrates.
Yes, and we've talked a little bit about Plato as well. I think he would be Plato.
Like, there's got to be like a GH in there and an apostrophe, and like, how would you spell Plato? PLA''TOGH or something?
I think that's about right. Yeah, there's got to be an apostrophe. Every epic Klingon, well, I say that, and Worf doesn't have an apostrophe in it, but every epic Klingon name has an apostrophe in it. So as long as you get the apostrophe in, I think you're good.
So here in the real world, we have Plato's Republic, but in our alternate Klingon world, we get Plato's Empire,
where they don't tell the stories of Kahless, but they tell the stories of Worf.
Right. Well, Mike, one of the other connections I thought was interesting in this episode is the role of cultural identity in general. I mean, we here in the 21st century live in a melting pot society where people leave their homelands and go to another place. They come to the United States or wherever they happen to go elsewhere in the world. To some extent, whenever you do that, you shed your old cultural identity and you assimilate, if not in one generation, then 2 or 3 or 4. And historically here in the course of the United States, we have this terrible history of slavery where, people from Africa were taken over here and made slaves and they lost their cultural identity. And so this losing of cultural identity that I see in this episode is interesting. Like, which flavor of cultural identity is this? I mean, is this a bunch of Klingons and Romulans deciding to live together in peace, shedding their old identities and coming up with a new melting pot identity in some sort of positive sense? Or is this more like slaves losing their African identity in this really negative, terrible sense?
I'm not sure, but I know one thing. I really wish the Romulans would find a different tailor. These poor Klingons, they have to pack their armor up in boxes. We don't pull it out. We don't look at it. We let our knives get rusty. Our batliths are laying there dull. But these Romulans are still walking around in those nasty pointy shoulder tunics that they wear. I mean, what's up with that?
Doesn't seem like they shed as much of their identity as the
Yeah,
Klingons did.
not shedding as much of their identity. And isn't that true of most societies, though? I mean, in all fairness, I think that's one of the things that, as a Star Trek fan, as someone who's watching this episode, that's something that I think is in there on purpose. This idea that it seems like the Klingons are giving up more to maintain this peace that they have, this utopia that they've built with these Romulans. Now, in fairness, the Romulans had the upper hand. The Klingons were prisoners. There's really this story that is told how the Klingons, were offered an opportunity to leave, but they had really, in the eyes of the Empire, they had lost their honor. And so to save face with their families back on the homeworld, on the Klingon homeworld, they chose to stay. And so, this Romulan commander gives up his military career to stay there. He falls in love with a Klingon woman, marries her, and they have a child together. And so he seems to be invested, and there's you can identify with him a little bit, and he's almost sympathetic, but it's very clear that he still has the controlling hand, and really in many ways are suppressing the Klingons from really being Klingon, all in the name of the peace and the utopian society that they've built.
I do think you can plausibly say that from the Romulans' perspective, you could say, look, we've built a beautiful thing here. We could have executed these Klingons. We could have kept them as prisoners, but we lived together, maybe not quite as equals, but at least in harmony, and we've built a life together. And you could say, look, we did a pretty good thing in building this community. Plausibly. I like comparing that perspective with the perspective of the young Klingons. I think the anger of the young Klingons and coming to realize that their true heritage and their cultural knowledge was hidden from them, was not shared with them, wasn't passed down. I think they're rightfully angry about that. They didn't get a choice in the matter. It's not like they got the chance to choose to ignore their cultural background. It was really hidden from them. But, if I compare that perspective with the perspective of anyone who's a child or a descendant of an immigrant family, think of Irish that came to the United States, or Africans or Russians or, Mexicans, anyone who's come to the United States from a different heritage, after a generation or two or three, as that cultural knowledge gets watered down to some degree, do those people have a right to be angry that their true heritage wasn't passed down to them?
Zachary, this goes back to something that you and I have talked a lot about in the Turbo Lift around here, and that is our interest in our genealogies. Building our family trees, researching, our ancestry. And
yeah, actually, a little known fact about that in my alternate future Klingon history, tracing your genealogy back to Worf is a thing.
That would definitely be
he's like the Charlemagne. All the Europeans can trace their ancestry back to Charlemagne. All of the future Klingons eventually, after several hundred years, can trace their ancestry back to Worf.
It's like Abraham with the Jewish people.
Yeah, little known facts here on Metatrex.
Father Worf had many sons. Many sons had Father Worf. I'm one of them, and so are you. That's what the little Klingon children sing in the future in this colony. But,
Yeah, your descendants will be like 1,000 blades in the sky.
But as I've researched my own genealogy, I grew up knowing that my father's family were Scottish and Irish immigrants. And that was really, even though I had very limited contact with that side of my family, that was something that was really passed down to me, and it was done so, with pride. I was to have pride in the fact, that I had, Scottish and Irish ancestry. And it's interesting because as I've done my own ancestry research, as I've researched my own family tree, I actually found out that my father's mother is actually descended from the French. And I had no idea that I had any kind of French heritage, and I don't have just a little bit of French heritage. Her lineage goes back directly to King Louis. I mean, the Merovingian kings.
I was going to say, I thought maybe you had a Picard ancestor in there somewhere.
That would be fascinating. But, how interesting is that to discover that? And it's something that, and it happens to all of us, I think, to some degree, as the generations move on, we move further and further away, especially, coming into, as you mentioned, this melting pot that we are here in the United States, where, my ancestry are mostly immigrants from Europe. I think it's fascinating when we think about, these Klingons, and here we are just a generation removed from these Klingons who were prisoners of war. And we have this next generation of Klingons coming up who, their heritage that's packed away in boxes. They don't talk about it. Their victory songs are sung as lullabies, and they don't understand the meaning of them. And the things that they use to sharpen their skills as warriors and as hunters are being used as toys out in the play yard. And it's something to be ashamed of instead of something to be proud of.
I think there's just something so tragic about this. I mean, when I see the rested Klingon bat'leth, and I hear the songs that are supposed to be, victory songs, but they're being sung as lullabies, there's just this lack of understanding about what it all really means, and it's just really tragic. I feel bad for the young Klingons that don't understand who they are, and I think that's true here in the real world. I mean, think how many epic deeds of the past and how many meaningful life stories are not passed down because people don't tell their descendants, and they don't tell their descendants, and these stories are just lost. And there's something tragic about that. So if you're listening to this and you don't know who your ancestors are, that's your homework assignment, is to go find out who your ancestors were and where you came from and what it all means. But that said, at the same time, I feel like there's this, the counterpoint to that is that your identity is not fully defined by your ancestry. Like the meaningfulness of these Klingons' lives can't be defined by the deeds of their ancestors or their situation here on this colony, right? It's up to each one of those people to decide what all of the past and what all of this means to them and what they're going to do with it going forward. And you can always go, yeah, I don't care about what those dead people did, what's happening today, and I'm going to make my own life what I want it to be, regardless of what happened in the past. So this tension between what happened in the past and how much that informs your identity versus what you want to make of your own life, for yourself in the future, regardless of the past. I think that's an interesting tension in someone's life.
Indeed, I think you're right. And really that is the driving philosophy in the first episode of this two-parter. In Birthright Part 1, that is both Worf's and Data's dilemma in this episode. Data, and I don't want to jump away from this idea of melting pots and cultural identity, but I think we're on a relevant thread here.
Data doesn't have any ancestry to speak of, right? He has no. He's analogous to the young Klingons. He doesn't have a past either.
Yeah, indeed. Dr. Soong being the closest thing he has to an ancestry, and I think he connects very strongly with Dr. Soong, whom he only met very briefly, but in the first part of this episode, they're docked at Deep Space Nine, and Julian Bashir is working on this device that they found in the Gamma Quadrant, and Data gets involved, and in the process of working with this piece of equipment, Data is electrocuted.
Do you think that, like Worf, Data refuses not to be electrocuted?
Well, he questions the whole thing and that's the interesting thing. He was out just for a few seconds, but he refused to believe that he was out. He refused to accept what had happened because he had memories from the time that he was down, and those memories were of a young Dr. Soong. And so he becomes fascinated by this. And Worf, who's just received this revelation that Moog may still be alive in this colony, he has to deal with it, and Data and Worf have a conversation, and Data and Worf are talking, and Worf says that there's a Klingon ritual in which you receive a revelation about your father, and there's nothing more important than receiving that revelation about your father. And Worf says to him, quote, "Your father is a part of you, always. Learning about him teaches you about yourself. That's why no matter where he is or what he has done, you must find him." End quote. So there's a connection there about the identity of your ancestry being a big part of who you are.
Well, we know that Data likes to explore culture, right? He paints Mondrian paintings and amongst other things. Do you think that he, in his spare time, is writing a series of dialogues about Dr. Sung? Something tells me android dialogues aren't as interesting as Klingon dialogues.
I've got a box. It's actually sitting right here to my left in my studio, and the box is full of old photographs and documents and things that I've found.
Oh, I've got my box right over here.
Yeah.
As luck would have it. Anyone who's interested in genealogy has a box in their office.
Yeah. So, I've got, and mine is a box that you would buy, 10 reams of copy paper in. That's my box.
My box is bigger than your box.
I'm sure it is, because we've talked. You're actually kind of the keeper of your family's records. You've been very fortunate that your family members bring those things to you, and I've had to research most of mine on my own because, again, my family really doesn't hand those things down. It's a shame, but it's true.
Well, it's funny you say that because this is meaningful to me. Like, I do have boxes, plural, of photographs and letters and documents. And for me, that's meaningful. These are objects of reverence. I mean, I have my grandfather's table that he bought after he got married in 1909. And I have that very table. And I've got pictures of this table from like 1915, and it's my table that's now in my living room. I like that continuity. That's an object of reverence for me. It adds meaningfulness to my life in ways that it doesn't for everyone. I talk to other family members even, and they just don't feel that connection to history and objects and artifacts and whatnot. But for me, that adds meaningfulness. And I feel like Worf is like that. This Klingon heritage adds meaning to his life.
I agree. And that philosophy really becomes a part of his own, and I hate to use this word, but it's relevant. That thread becomes a major part of his own personal tapestry, just as our ancestry discoveries become. Each time we find a new thread, or we find a new document, or we find a new fact, a new person to add to our ancestry story, it becomes a part of our own personal tapestry.
I just have one question for you, Mike. If my house gets dishonored, can I join yours? Can I join the House of Morrison?
You will always be welcome in the House of Morrison.
Hey, that's good to know. It's good to have a backup plan.
I would be honored. But, here in my little box, each time I find a new document, it becomes a part of my own personal tapestry. And their story, each of these stories are unique. I mean, there's stories of just living simple, quiet lives. There are stories of overcoming impossible obstacles, stories of weathering, the difficulties of war, personal tragedy, and
the Picards that fought at Trafalgar, the Picard that settled the first Martian colony.
Yes. And again, now I'm finding out that
the Morrisons that fill in the blank.
Indeed. And now I'm finding out that, there's a royal tie there, and a very interesting one. One of the sons of a French king who, basically gave up his title, and, another generation removed, and they were commoners and became nomadic, and eventually, moved further north into Europe. And, so the story goes. And again, that has been woven into my personal fabric. And I think Worf very much is trying to, and I think this is a lot because he was raised by humans, much the same way with Data. He didn't really know Dr. Sung. He was found by a couple of Starfleet officers, and he's trying to piece together his past the same way Worf is trying to piece together his own. And as these pieces get found, ultimately that's what led Worf to this colony. He was going in search of the story of Moog. What happened to Moog? He had always assumed he had died at Kittimer, but maybe he didn't. And so he was going to find that out, no matter what it was he discovered. In fact, he has this conversation with a Klingon elder who says, your father died here or died at Kittimer, and I'm glad he did, that he didn't have to bear the dishonor that, that we have. And Worf says, if I would have found my father, I would have been glad, regardless of what happened, I would have been glad. And, the Klingon responds by saying, I hope if my son were to find me here like this, he'd be Klingon enough to kill me, which is a very Klingon thing to say.
Well, I know I'm just one guy, Zach the philosopher, so who am I to tell anyone what they should be doing in life or what they should find meaningful or how they should identify themselves? But I have this conviction that people who don't feel this tie to the past or their ancestry or their history or their cultural heritage are missing something. For me, that's part of who I am, part of my identity. It's not my full identity, but it's part of my identity. And I feel like people who don't have that connection are missing something. And I feel like you can kind of divide this into two camps. There are the people that are interested in that and they identify with it in some way, and everyone's different. Everyone's got their own stories and it means something to different to different people, but it's meaningful in some way. And then there's the camp of people that are like, I don't care. That's not me. Those people are dead. I'm just going to live my life as I see fit. And that's not who I am. And I'm going to live my own life. And those are two kind of totally different camps. And it's interesting to think about what each camp would say about the other. I think the camp that finds all that stuff meaningful looks at the other side and would say, oh, you're kind of missing something. You Klingons who don't have a tie to your past, we feel something for them in this episode because they're missing something. They need that tie to their Klingon heritage that they've been denied. And yet the people on the other side of the fence who don't feel this connection to their history or ancestry, these rugged individualists that just want to live their own lives, I think they look at people who do feel this tie to their ancestry and say, whoa, you're totally bound by the past. Look how constraining that is for your identity. You're bound by it. You're not free to live your own life. So it's interesting and I don't think there's a right way to cut this up. I think you just have two different personality types at play here, but it's interesting to see that each side sees a weakness or a lack in the other.
I think Worf is this interesting, and we've talked about this before, this interesting series of contradictions. He's Klingon enough that he's going to find this out because, I mean, he's not just Worf, he's Worf, the son of Moog. So ancestry is very important.
And founder of the Neo Talk the neo-Worfism movement, the neo-talkism movement.
Yeah. But
don't forget that.
Ancestry is very important to Klingons. And I think that's well established in Star Trek universe. It's essential. And the past, the stories, they're essential. They are the foundation of what it is to be Klingon.
And that's stronger for Klingons than for humans in the Star Trek universe, for sure.
Indeed it is. But Worf is a contradiction because he's not Klingon enough to kill his father, but he is Klingon enough to make sure that this next generation understand what those victory songs are about and what those toys really are, and that box of armor that you have over there. And
this is where the parallel with Socrates breaks down, because Socrates, he feels he can't pick and choose, be selective about which laws of Athens to follow, whereas Worf is more than willing to pick and choose which parts of the Klingon heritage he identifies with.
Sure. And as he finds himself, being forced to integrate into this colony, he's kind of picking and choosing, how he's going to do it on his terms. And while he's there, he's going to do everything he can to influence these Klingons and try to stir within them, that desire to understand and know their Klingon heritage.
Yeah. Did you know that in one of the deleted scenes from this episode, Worf in his black turtleneck sits around writing Klingon beat poetry?
Well, it's funny because he does wear, he's got this black turtleneck and these black pants.
Hey, he's like the beat poet of the Klingon Empire. He's a beatnik, Klingon beatnik.
He's standing in the coffee house reading poetry. Yes. It's awesome.
I'm not sure the Klingons have what's the Klingon equivalent of a guitar? Like the Vulcans have their Vulcan lyre. What's the Klingon equivalent of a, folksy, beatnik Klingon guitar?
Yeah, I don't know.
Like, is he the Klingon Bob Dylan?
Hey, Mr. Batleth Man.
He's the voice of a new generation. Like Pepsi, but
Instead of Mr. Tambourine Man, it's Mr. Batleth Man. Hey, Mr. Wardrum Man.
Slay a targ for me.
Oh, that's awesome. But getting back,
I can't escape, and there ain't no place I'm going to.
Getting back to melting pots and cultural identity,
Yes, please bring it back.
bring it back. Again, I think that's a lost thread in Birthright, is this idea of cultural identity, and it's true for Data as well. I mean, he's trying to make that connection to Dr. Soong, and that's the whole reason he starts this little dream experiment of his, is to try to connect to his cultural identity. It's about personal identity in this case, pulling that identity from our culture, from, as Worf and Data discussed, your father being a part of you. I think that really is the overriding thread of this two-parter.
Well, I mean, I think these factors are important, like we've discussed. You think they're important too, but I don't think it's obvious that this is important. I mean, imagine one of these young Klingons in this colony saying, "Screw my Klingon heritage, I'm going to act like a Romulan, and that's who I am now. So take that, Worf."
Well, and that was Talk's attitude at first.
And that would be, there's nothing wrong with that. Or this is Star Trek. Tolerance is everything, right? So there would be nothing objectively wrong with a Klingon taking that approach. I think that Klingon would be missing out on something. You think that Klingon would be missing out on something. But if a Klingon wants to say, "Screw my Klingon heritage, I'm going to live a different kind of life. I'm going to join the Federation. I'm going to become a Klingon beat poet. I'm going to act like a Romulan." So what?
Yeah. Yeah.
I just don't think it's obvious that this matters in any objective sense. We're firmly in the realm of subjectivity here, I think.
Sure. And again, that's Talk's attitude at first. I think you're nuts. I don't think this is relevant. But
I like my Romulan ale, darn it.
But Worf is able to appeal, and I think this is really fascinating too. Worf just instantly, automatically knows how to appeal to the Klingon buried deep within Talk. I don't think it's nearly that easy in the real world, but Worf does quickly connect him to what it means to be Klingon.
Well, I think what these young Klingons are lacking is an identity. Yes, they're in this colony, but they have no broader context for understanding who they are in their lives. And I think within each of them, there's got to be this hunger to know who they really are.
Yeah. Well, I think in the case of the Klingon girl, Bael, she is curious about this chest that her mother keeps in their home, and she says to Worf, "I'm not supposed to be in this box. I'm not supposed to be, looking at these things." And she doesn't know what they are, and Worf has to, which, I'm a Star Trek fan, and I'm looking at that going, that's battle armor. Any doofus knows that, but she has no idea what that armor is. Well, this is warrior's armor, and this is this, and that is that, and he's explaining it to her, and she pulls out a necklace, and isn't it pretty? Well, that's something that a Klingon woman would give to her daughter when she's come of age and is old enough to take a mate.
So I feel like Worf missed a terrific opportunity for some Klingon comedy. Like he could have said, "Oh, that's part of this important Klingon ritual known as Duck, Duck, Goose."
Are you saying that?
It's a good thing I wasn't there doing. I would.
Are you saying it could be argued that he was taking Talk on a snipe hunt?
Yes, a Klingon snipe hunt. I can picture Worf now. "Okay, everyone, grab your pillowcases. We're going on a Targ hunt.
You have your bag.
Targ and irony quotes. We're going on a Targ hunt.
It's a Klingon snipe hunt. And the joke was on him when Talk actually slew an animal.
I think Worf must be a nicer guy than I am.
Talk, you have your bag. Show no fear.
What other Klingon practical jokes could there be? Klingon duck, duck, goose. Klingon snipe hunts.
Oh, that's rich.
You know, do you think Worf packed his Klingon whoopee cushion?
I'm not even sure I want to know what those things sound like.
I can picture it now. Sit here and await your execution. Bleh. Well, Mike, since beating dead Targs is kind of what we're doing here tonight, do we want to wrap up the Klingon theme and talk a little bit more about Data's dream program? Is there anything else relevant that we should talk about there?
I think we have exhausted the Klingon threads in this two-parter. Although I have to say,
well, if we're talking about Klingon whoopee cushions, I think it might be time to move on.
It's time to move on. I feel like that weird Klingon uncle just showed up to the party, and it's time to pack up and go home.
Yeah, right. The brother of Moog. Worf's crazy uncle.
That's Gowron and his family, crazy Uncle Gowron. There is one other thread I think that is worth talking about in Birthright, and that is really what kind of, in many ways, kicks this two-part episode off, and that is the accident that ultimately leads to Data's experimentation with dreaming.
Well, we're a little outside the realm of philosophy and into the realm of psychology, insofar as Data has to try to interpret the meaningfulness of the symbols inside this dream that he's just had.
Yeah, but I think that there's still some philosophical aspects to it, because the symbols, this whole idea of dreaming, more than the
Well, this is important. I feel like in our modern rationalist 21st century way of life, we don't give a lot of credence to dreams, right? We prioritize rationality and our waking lives, and our dreams are like these danglers that, yes, they might be tied to our subconscious, but they don't matter in our day-to-day lives. And I feel like getting back to sort of getting in touch with your dream life and the meaningfulness of those experiences is something that is at tension with our modern rationalist approach to modern life.
I think it's somewhat more simplistic than that for Data. I think more than the symbology of his dream, although that's important. And, there's that aspect where he's trying to interpret and understand the images that he's seen. He's even somewhat confused when the images change. But more than that, it's the idea that he connects dreaming to what it is to be human. So we're going back to this idea of Data's own personal identity and his connection to humanity with the ability to dream, but also, as we've mentioned, the symbology and understanding his own heritage and his own ancestry.
I think the Star Trek universe takes an interesting perspective on all of these issues, dreaming, mythology, religion, because I do feel like here in the 21st century modern world, we don't tend to prioritize those things. We don't believe in grand narratives of progress. We don't believe in heroes. We don't believe in epics. We don't believe in our mythology anymore. Those are just things we've culturally let go by the wayside. And new ones emerge, like Star Trek is its own mythology, and Star Wars, for Star Wars fans, is its own mythology. So we do have this kind of fictional mythology, but we don't believe in in myths. We don't believe in epics. We don't really believe in heroes anymore. And in Star Trek, whenever these things come up, Star Trek characters are encouraged to pursue understanding their heritage or their mythology or their religion or their dream lives. And largely in Star Trek The Next Generation, it's Counselor Troy going, oh, Data, you should pursue your, understanding your dreams. And Worf, you should understand your Klingon heritage. But the Star Trek universe is amazingly tolerant of genuinely believing in mythology and religion and dreams and all of this stuff that we have tended to let go by the wayside culturally.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think that's one of the things that really connects me to this episode, because that, again, is this predominant thread within Birthright, is this idea of connecting personal identity to, in Data's case, to dreaming, his quest to be human, and that connecting, that quest connecting to his ability to dream, and his connection to Dr. Soong and the images that he sees within his dreams. And for Worf, it's going to this encampment, this colony, and trying to make that connection to his father that he barely knew.
I mean, maybe I'm living in like a West Coast, Bay Area, California bubble here, but it's like if I showed up one day and I said, hey, everyone, I want to pursue my mythological heritage by understanding Greek mythology or Roman mythology, and I'm going to make that part of my identity now. Here in the Bay Area, they'd be like, who cares? Do you know how to code or what? Like, if you can't program it in Python, we're not interested.
Yeah.
So, that's the kind of world I live in here in the Bay Area. Oh, that's not true. This is an artsy area too. Don't get me wrong. I'm giving a caricature of this area, but I do feel like culturally, we don't care about those things. Those aren't meaningful. You can't invent anything with it. You can't start a business about that. That's not going to pay your bills. It's not practical. So we just don't care about that. Yeah, it might be important to you, but so what? It's not, it doesn't do anything for you. And I do feel like culturally that's generally our perception. We go, okay, if you're interested in that, yay, everyone's interested in something, but that's not going to get you through life. So don't care about it too much.
And that's fascinating to me, because I think that's true no matter where you're at in the country. Here in the state of Texas, you talked about your caricature of, the Bay Area that you live in. Here in the state of Texas, the caricature is, this ultra identity with the South and, our own republic, and everything's bigger, and Texans are, tougher than nails, and remember the Alamo, and that's what people think when they think of.
If Texas has a mythology, it's a big one.
It's a very big one, but indeed, Texas, like many areas of the country, is increasingly becoming a melting pot. We have a very diverse culture here in the state of Texas anymore. I think that's true in a lot of places. I'm originally from West Virginia, where immediately when I would go somewhere, people would check to see if I was wearing shoes, and I'm a hillbilly, and we had this, this idea of these shoeless, toothless hillbillies in West Virginia, and that's what everybody thinks of when I say I'm from West Virginia. But indeed, the culture is very, very diverse, and there's not a lot of racial diversity in at least the area that I was from in West Virginia, but in the eastern part of the state, it's increasingly becoming more and more diverse, and it's indicative of what's happening here in our country, Zachary. And that is that, just as we've talked about, we've become this melting pot, and I think in that melting pot, it is, as we've already mentioned, it's very easy for us to forget who we are, to let go of. And I don't think that in a melting pot we have to forget our roots. We have to forget, who we are and where we're from. And for Data, Data is trying to connect with his heritage and connect with what he aspires to be, and that's humanity. And I think there's a beautiful balance there of him trying to be what he aspires to be, but still connect with where he came from.
There's an interesting parallel between our increasingly globalized society and the, pardon the phrase, galactic society that you see inside the Star Trek universe, right? We live in a cultural melting pot, and the interplay of the Federation and the Klingon Empire and this sort of intragalactic society that you see in the Star Trek universe is similar. That's a type of melting pot too. And in a non-melting pot society, if you're purely, like, say you're born and raised and all you know is the Klingon Empire, right? There's no question of identity. You're a Klingon and that's who you are, and you don't know anything different, right? So the question doesn't even come up. But in a melting pot society, each person now has to face the choice, like, which parts of my cultural heritage do I know about, or do I learn more about, or do I identify with? And which parts do I let go by the wayside for the sake of living in a modern world that's multicultural and intercultural and cultural and diverse and modern, right? And each person is going to make a different choice about that. But I guess my point is just that in a melting pot society, that becomes an issue, and it does become a choice that people have to wrestle with. Whereas if you're not in a melting pot society, if you're purely restricted to your own cultural and your own heritage and your own background with no exposure to the outside, it's not even an issue. It's not relevant to your personal identity because you don't know anything different. You just are a Klingon if you're born and raised in the Klingon Empire, and that's all you know. Say hundreds of years ago, before the Klingons interacted with the outside, when they were just on their own homeworld, right? There was just a Klingon. That's just who you were, a Klingon. There wasn't a question of how do I combine my Klingon values with the Federation values that I see with those humans over there. That's just not an issue until contact happens. And as cultures mesh more and more, each individual person is just forced to make the choice. And you can not make a choice. You can just go, I don't care. I'm just going to live my modern life and I don't care. But if you're even remotely interested in your heritage, you then have to decide, okay, how much of this background and cultural history defines who I am? And that's my choice. And how much do I not care about for the sake of living in a diverse, multicultural, modern society, and how do you find the balance between the two? And I just find it interesting that question of personal identity is an issue in a melting pot society in a way that it's not in a pre-melting pot society.
Worf really does this successfully, I think. I think it can be argued that he does this successfully in the Star Trek universe. Although he has conflicts from time to time, there are occasions where the Klingon in him is at conflict with these Federation values that he's come to accept. But by and large, he is a Klingon who has managed to remain Klingon and still assimilate by and large to a Federation society. And I've been thinking about examples even in our own world. And I have to say, and I give a shout out to our founder and publisher, Christopher Jones. One of the things I really enjoy about following him, Chris is from Alabama. He has lived pretty much his entire adult life in Japan, which is a culture, 180 degrees opposite of the one he was raised in. And he and I have had this conversation before, and he really, by and large, identifies as Japanese. That's who he is. But it really puts a smile on my face during football season because he is such an Alabama fan. I mean, Roll Tide, He has managed to assimilate into an entirely different culture and still hold on to those things that make him essentially, I think, American. And so there's proof in the Star Trek universe that it can be done, and there's proof here in our own world. Chris, if you're listening, man, we appreciate you more than you know, and thanks for holding the torch for all of us.
Honestly, I feel like the Star Trek universe doesn't have enough fun with this. Like, okay, yes, we've got Worf, who has to find a balance between his Klingon heritage and his human values, but I want to see a Klingon that decides to identify as something like an Andorian. Like, to picture a Klingon with some blue face paint, little rubber antennas, like, oh, you're Klingon, but you identify as an Andorian. Why don't they do that kind of? That would be really interesting.
No,
it would be silly, but it would be interesting.
And he's totally in denial. No, I'm cosplaying as William Wallace. That's why I've got the blue paint on my face. Go away.
But I'm serious. You really don't see this very much. I mean, yes, we have a melting pot, but we don't see a conscious choice to identify as a member of a totally different background. Very much.
No, we don't. And that's Odo's. I think that's Odo's struggle to a great degree. He is a changeling who has tried as best he could to assimilate into, the Bajoran culture, into the culture of the solids, and he maintains that shape of that Bajoran as best he's able to maintain it. That's his conflict. But you're right, we don't see it a whole lot in the Star Trek universe, and I think that it's worth exploring, especially as you've already mentioned, our society, our world becomes increasingly global, and people are, like Chris Jones, living in other countries and putting down roots and assimilating into cultures different than the one they were raised in.
Do you think Odo has this secret desire to identify as a Vulcan? Do you think when he goes back to his quarters, he shapeshifts and grows little Vulcan ears? And then when someone pushes the door, the door button, and goes, you hear the doo-doo-doo-doo, does he go, oh, quick, hide the ears?
Yeah. And if anybody notices, he says, I have difficulty with the ears. That's just his excuse.
What if everyone in the Star Trek universe is harboring this secret identity? Like, Captain Picard, he's got like a Romulan outfit in his quarters that he puts on once in a while to go to sleep, like Romulan pajamas. And Riker, Riker identifies as someone from Rise, obviously.
Although I have to say that he did pretty well hanging out with the Klingons during that whole officer exchange. I think Riker handled himself quite well. Cisco, the whole bald thing, it's actually because he was trying to identify as Bolian. That's why. There you have it, Metatrex listeners. That is the whole reason why the latter seasons of Deep Space Nine, Cisco went bald. He was doing it because secretly at night he was cosplaying as a Bolian.
He actually got a great haircut from Mott while he was over on the Enterprise, but right at the start of Deep Space Nine. So he said, "Oh, yeah, that guy's a cool guy," and that just percolated for 5 years, and then he went bald. I always liked that Mott guy.
Well, Zachary, do you have any final thoughts before we close out today's show?
No, I don't think so. Only just to say maybe that the connection between Worf and Socrates is an interesting one. I'm glad we spent quite a few minutes talking about that. Other than that, I worry that maybe we turned this episode into a little bit of a farce with all of the tomfoolery that we pursued in this episode. But I do think all the connections we made were interesting. The connection between Worf and Socrates is interesting. The issue of cultural identity in a melting pot society that's increasingly important in our global society. And of course, the role of dreams and by extension mythology and religion and meaningfulness for Data with his dream program. That's really interesting stuff too. So even though this is not an often talked about episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, I hope we've shown that it's actually one of the best and most philosophically interesting despite that fact.
It is philosophically interesting. And that's really, when we were talking about this in Metatrex 64, just talking about the 6th season of The Next Generation and making the connections here for Birthright. I think you and I were both really surprised by the Worf-Socrates connection, and that was really interesting. But I think these two episodes, and I think it's really hinted in the title, Birthright. It really is a 2-part episode about identity, the nature of identity as it relates to our culture, our heritage. I think it's an important episode philosophically that oftentimes gets looked over. We had a lot of fun with it, and I'm glad we were able to have fun with it. We're a little bit more serious most of the time, and it's fun to yuck it up a little bit and have some fun. And I think we were able to do that, but still bring out some of the very interesting threads that I think are often overlooked in Birthright.
I did have to chew on this one for a while, though. When you first mentioned that you wanted to keep talking about Birthright, I was kind of like, oh, really? You want to keep talking about that? It's a good connection, but is there really anything interesting to talk about? And I had to percolate on it for a week. So you first mentioned that a little over a week ago, and I was thinking, okay, yeah, we'll do that. And then secretly I was going, oh man, I don't know what we're going to talk about. So I rewatched it and I thought about it. And, a couple days ago, it finally started to gel and I managed to find some connections. But this is one I really did have to stew on to know what to talk about today.
And look, we would have missed out on talking about, Romulan hemlock and Klingon snipe hunts.
I had to brood like only Worf can.
gritting your teeth and sharpening your batleth, knocking the rust off. Well, Zachary, it's been fun talking about Birthright, both parts 1 and 2, but this isn't the only thing that we've been talking about here on Trek FM this past week. So here's a quick look, everyone, at some other things you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Standard Orbit.
That's not to take away anything that they are. They have the same standard of excellence. They are as brilliant, as smart. They're good leaders, but they're guys who go home. They're guys who drink. They're guys who go to the bar. They're guys who get in fist fights. They're guys who have wives and argue, and they're guys who deal with loss.
To the journey!
I've just got this vision now of Janeway there. Who's a good Voyager? Who's a good girl?
Well, she liked to, stroke the halls and everything.
So Tom Paris would be like, "Who's a good girl? You want to go for a ride? Let's go."
Literary Treks.
I'm glad we reread this because at the time I did read this, it was when the new movie was out. But now that we've had the 3 movies, as you just mentioned, and I've seen Star Trek 09 about 100 times, I'm very familiar with the movie and not as much as with the comic now because I've only read it maybe a couple of times.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
So check out these and other shows and find out what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button. That helps us out greatly, and it makes it easier for other listeners to find the shows as they search iTunes. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and of course you can always stream and download the MP3 file from our website and grab the RSS link as well. You can also find us, Zachary, now on YouTube as well as Google Play Music. Another way you can help us keep all our shows coming to you each week is to become a patron of the network on Patreon. If you visit patreon.com/TrekFM, that's patreon.com/TrekFM, you'll find our current goals and different milestone contribution levels along with all the great perks that we have for you. These perks include things like early access to content, exclusive content, producer credits, seats on our content development team, and many more. We really appreciate any support that you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society that will design and launch an 8-foot orbiter and return the craft to Earth. The NSS Enterprise orbiter will carry more than 100 student-designed science experiments into space, and you can help make it happen. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and to get your seat on the mission. Well, if you'd like to contact us with feedback or suggestions for the show, or to send us your thoughts on anything we discussed in this episode of Metatreks, you can contact us in several different ways. You can contact us via a form. Simply go to trek.fm/contact.
If you'd like to leave us a voicemail, you can look in the sidebar on our Metatrek show page on the Trek FM website, or you can go to speakpipe.com/TrekFM.
Our Twitter handle is simply @TrekFM.
On Facebook, you can find us at facebook.com/TrekFM. And while you're on Facebook, find us in the Babel Conference. The Babel Conference is Trek FM's listeners-only discussion group. Just type the Babel Conference, that's BABEL, into the search field on Facebook. Or you can go to our website at trek.fm and click Discussion on the menu bar.
We also invite you to leave a rating and review of Metatreks on iTunes. We'd love to hear your feedback and suggestions for the show. Well, Zachary, when you're not organizing a game of Duck, Duck, Goose, Klingon style, where can our listeners find you on the interwebs and around the Trek FM network?
Well, you can find me elsewhere on Trek FM as co-host of To the Journey, Trek FM's dedicated Voyager podcast, along with my co-hosts there, Kay Shaw and Suzanne Williamson. You can always find me in the Babel Conference if you want to talk about Star Trek and philosophy with me there. And you can find me on Twitter. My handle is just my name, @Zachary Fruhling. That's Zachary, ZACHARY, Fruhling, FRUHLING. And Mike, when you're not dressing up as an Andorian in your quarters, where can people find you on the Trek FM network and around the interwebs?
I like Andorians' pink skin.
I'm not knocking Andorians. I have nothing against blue-skinned people.
Well, Zachary, you can find me always.
I have I have some Andorian friends.
Well, Zachary, I am always around Facebook. That's where I'm most active. Certainly, you can catch me in the Babel Conference. I would love to talk Star Trek and philosophy with you there. On Twitter, my Twitter handle is @cmichael1701. If you follow me, be sure to let me know so I can follow you back. On Instagram, it's cmichael1701. You can also read my blog about my journey of publishing and a little bit about life. That is cmichael1701.wordpress.com. Well, Zachary, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Metatrex team from around the network. Specifically, we'd like to thank C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek.fm. Our executive producers, Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp. Aaron Harvey is our art director. Richard Marquez is our production manager. And our Patreon manager, Brandon Shea Mutala. We'd also like to give a shout out to our 3 associate producers that keep the dilithium in the Starship of Theseus. They are Patrick Devlin. You can catch Patrick on Twitter. His Twitter handle is @MagicDrop5. Kay Shaw, your co-host over at To The Journey. Her Twitter handle is @ChocoWeeble. And Kit Lofstad. Her Twitter handle is @MotherCat. That's mother with a 0. Well, thank you, everyone, for listening to Metatrex, a Star Trek and Philosophy podcast. Until next time, when we will once again boldly go where no philosophers have gone before.